this out. I've always loved this song. I've heard it live a couple times.
You could give me lots of reasons to walk right out of here, or you could beg me to stay. You know you're gonna disappear. You could smile and say nothing, enjoy the challenge of your secrecy. You can have another lover, babe. Just don't let it get back to me. 'Cause when I can feel up, I feel alright. And when I don't like what I see, I turn out the light. I don't wanna live. Last night I walked right by a homeless man. I stared into space. 'Cause even if I gave him everything I had, I could not make his world a better place. This great green world where there's enough for all. Don't tell me salvation's too much to handle. They tell me reach out and change the world. And I reach out and change the channel. 'Cause when I can feel the pain, I feel alright. And when I don't like what I see, I turn off the light. 'Cause I don't wanna know what's going on. I don't wanna know what's going on. I don't wanna know what's going on. What's going on? What's going on? I wanna know.
Hey guys.
Here we are finally.
There's some technical difficulties. We couldn't get my Periscope to work. which is where most of y'all view this at. But welcome back to another edition of the Ides. We're actually doing the Ides on the Ides for a change.
This time, yep.
This one's called The Devil's Dilemma. In the world,
not of it.
Not of it. It's a good one, and we've got several things we're going to talk about. I usually try to give you a few bullet points, but we're just going to kind of go down some different topics, and then at the end talk about the Devil's Dilemma. But basically, it's about a false binary or two choices,
and the devil's narrative in the world, and how we all need to we've gone through this ourselves. We're still going through it. We have to kind of step back and see a bigger picture, and it's not as a dichotomy like we get presented throughout the years. And me and Yvonne have seen throughout, especially the last 100 plus years, say going back 150, 170 years, that it's really picked up the narrative and listening to the world instead of God and what's in your hearts. We've talked about discernment and wisdom and stuff, and how you can find your own. And you can start with Adam and Eve, that they made that first wrong choice, didn't use their discernment the way they should have. And that's where at the end, we're going to do some bullet points about what we think are key events in history that kind of set up where we are today and how we maybe get out of it. And at the end, we'll talk about what we see with Devil's Dilemma and what that is,
right,
and how to start seeing things in a different light.
Right. And since this is the first time we've ever live streamed on YouTube, my name is Yvonne Burton. This is my brother, Lewis Everett, and we've been doing this Ides, make the Ides great again, since 2016 or 17.
This is our 37th episode. We missed a couple this year, but and set for 2 this year. We've been on every month. We started it out as make the Ides great again because we were, I fell for the Trump train like a lot of people did. And I think there were a lot of positive things that come out inadvertently that a veil was taken off on the world for a lot of us that choose to see it.
He ripped off a lot of veils on a lot of things.
He broke some paradigms and stuff, but we kept going with making the Ides great again because it's bigger than politics in the United States.
And the Ides used to be a time of celebration. It wasn't the Shakespeare's play. It was a time,
which is another point where Shakespeare took something that was good and made it bad, because it became, beware the Ides, and it was the play with Julius Caesar being assassinated.
Right, and that's what the devil always does, because there's no originality with the devil. He always latches on to the good.
He copies and inverts it, and that's all. That'll be in the Devil's Dilemma we talk about at the end.
Right.
But we talked about Adam and Eve already, and Adam and Eve made that fateful choice that sent us down this road. But then we're going to make a huge leap throughout time and get into the mid 1800s, to the late 19th century, going into.
Let me just say something about Adam and Eve. We look back at like it was an ancient time that was so far away. But truthfully, we're all in the Garden of Eden with Satan tempting us, and it's easy to sit there and say that you wouldn't eat off the tree of knowledge of
good and evil.
But you know what? We're doing it every day.
Yeah.
So
when we try to be our own God instead of recognizing that our Creator actually has it all.
Right.
So we're going to get into the mid 1800s, and some of our scope tonight will touch on other previous scopes that we've done. It all kind of ties in, but we look at we're going to look at how modern medicine started to come about, and in the 1850s to the 1870s, even up to 1900, you've got Louis Pasteur, who's one of the foundations of modern medicine with his so-called discoveries, and we've been painted a picture about him, and he's this great man. He was in a rivalry with Beauchamp. So let me show this. There's a book I've ordered that I'm going to be reading soon. It's Pasteur versus Beauchamp, and there was a fight in the late 1800s between these two guys about what germs are and what viruses are, and Beauchamp was on the other side of this debate. But he got lost to history and I've only stumbled upon him, watching other people.
Well, we've all heard of Pasteur.
Everybody has. And what a lot of people don't know, and I didn't know this, is in part of his experiments that he did and what he was doing to, his virology and biology, he actually ended up killing one of his own kids with one of his experiments. And I just don't think that alone should kind of negate a lot of what we get from him. But this is going to be an interesting book to read.
And we're watching in current times how they're rewriting history live, like we're seeing how they do that, and watching how they write great glowing things about horrible men. It's nothing new under the sun. They've been doing it forever. So we would like you, as we go along, for you to think about the things you've been taught about these major events, these major names.
And it's going to Yvonne's going to throw a lot of information at you real quick and a lot to digest, but it's going back to discernment and your own wisdom.
And we need to be questioning
this ability. And, they write, if you read these, even the articles where they think they're lauding these people in history that have done bad things, if you read it and look at it in a different light and discern for yourself,
you can kind of decipher.
You can see the evil in there, even though they're trying to paint a glowing picture. They think it's good stuff that they're writing about.
Right.
And so Pasteur was also he had Napoleon III's backing, who was Napoleon's nephew from the Napoleonic Wars. He was in charge. He was the emperor of France. He was first elected president, but then he wanted to stay in power, so he basically orchestrated a rewriting of it wasn't a constitution, but their laws at the time, and he basically engineered himself to be the next emperor.
Right, and let them vote on it for him to be the dictator.
And then, of course, he lost the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. He ended up dying in England in exile, but he was a big backer of Pasteur. And just a short side note, and this happens a lot. It happens with Einstein and other so-called great luminaries in the past.
Right.
Napoleon III married his cousin, and you can read this in Wikipedia, which is not the best source, but they write about it in the way that I can't remember how I saw it. It's
kind of like a detached.
He was Napoleon's nephew, but the woman he ended up marrying, when you do the bloodline, it's really simple. It's right there. He married his cousin.
Right.
And so big backer of Pasteur, but Yvonne's going to get into the Flexner report, which kind of laid it decimated all basically your small town doctors and everything, and it laid the groundwork for what you have today with modern medicine and how doctors and nurses, how everything is regulated, and even the pharmaceutical industry and things like that. And Pasteur kind of was a precursor to all this stuff. So let's get into the Flexner report, because it's
the Flexner report it's from 1910. Rockefeller is the one that commissioned it, but he did it either on behalf or in connection with the Carnegie Foundation. And basically the Flexner report was and they went and they analyzed the medical industry, the hospitals, the doctors, and how they were being educated. At the time, there was like 150 universities, and Flexner, it's Robert Flexner or Abraham Flexner is the guy that wrote the report. And basically, it flipped the medical industry upside down. Before this report, what you thought of when you went to the doctor, chiropractors, that was not thought of as kooky, or that was just normal. And then homeopathy, and actually there was a lot of women in the medical field at that time because they were into the nature of
and minorities,
homeopathy,
and people that got their expertise in treating other people. You knew your doctor or
it was heavily female. That's one of the things that Flexner report flipped.
Yeah.
So anyway, basically it determined what it wanted to do. It wanted to standardize. The goal was to get standards where you'd have, states, licensing only certain schools for this. And if you didn't abide by this, then the federal government.
You had to use their protocols, their ways, their learnings. You had to use their methods.
Right. And so what the Flexner report had the effect of was it came out, it caused a stir, but a bunch of very wealthy people like Robert Brookings, who founded the Brookings Institute. Of course, Rockefeller was involved, the Carnegie Foundation. And then the people that were involved in writing the Flexner. So Abraham Flexner wrote the Flexner report, but there were other doctors and people who were involved in it. And some of those people were from what's called the Hopkins Circle. And it was people like William Welsh, William Osler, what's the guy? Frederick Gates. But you see Johns Hopkins, you see how they come from these elites.
And Johns Hopkins is integral to all the things happening now too, and going back into the 50s and 60s as well. And this is where the basis of where all of it comes from. And in a most basic part, the Flexner report changed our medical industry from small town doctors that knew their patients, knew the whole person, not just a certain body part. And it changed it to a standardized, this is, almost like a factory for medicine.
They wanted the doctors to be, up until this point, the doctors were very connected with the patient. They knew them. They lived in their communities. They wanted to remove that connection, what's the word I'm looking for, that human connection where this doctor he wasn't just, coming to me. He didn't know me from Adam. And if I had cancer or if I had something, they removed the feelings
and when they treated you, they looked at your whole body. They looked at your whole system. You're a complete, God made us a certain way. We have immune systems. We have these organs. We have all these different systems that work together. System. And so now you have gastroenterologists and you have.
And this came from the Flexner report, and that's how you've got specialists. And so what the Flexner report did is came out, it caused a stir, but then because there was so much money, or we're talking big money, because there was so much money, they were able to successfully implement what they had written about here. And what they had determined was that a majority of medical schools were rated as defective with low admission standards, poor laboratory facilities, and minimal exposure to clinical material. Medical education at the turn of the century was a for-profit enterprise that was producing a surplus. Now,
and they say producing a surplus of poorly trained physicians. And this is according to them, because I would posit that American people as a whole in 1900 were a lot healthier than they are now.
Right.
And forget about COVID happening, whatever that is, really. There's a lot of otherwise sick people are dying of a lot of things, and those are the most vulnerable. But there are more people vulnerable to getting sick now than I think there was in the 1900s. We were tougher.
Yeah. And so one of the things that they did with the Flexner report is they made these rural doctors and the people that were into natural remedies. They claimed that all of those natural remedies that were supposedly successful were anecdotal, and they flipped the script.
And they try to make anecdotal a bad thing too, because the anecdote is kind of where you get experimentation in the first place, because people start observing events, and then that's where you start getting major studies and stuff. It all starts with anecdotal.
So what they did is the enactment of state licensing laws put teeth into the indictments of the report, and Flexner sounded the death knell for the for-profit medical schools in America. Well, for the for-profit little guys.
Yes.
And
that's how these people are writing this report, that they were getting rid of those evil profiteers. When your small town doctor that traveled, and these guys actually traveled to your house a lot. They came to you. You didn't go to them. They didn't have they may have had an office, but they came to you. And so that's their living.
Right.
You're allowed to make just like a
plumber
or an electrician.
They flipped that upside down and made us go to them. It's the success of the Flexner report, assured by the huge financial gifts of the Rockefeller and Carnegie foundations. This single model of medical education required large sums to support the scientific focus at its core. So from this, they created like the state licensing, medical universities. If you didn't abide by what they had decided in this report, they would shut you down. So out of I think 166 hospitals, they wanted to go down to 33 They ended up going down to about 71, but they shut down all of the rural hospitals. And at the time, there were 7 African American hospitals. They shut down all but 2 of them. If you read the Flexner report, which they write glowingly about today, it was very racist. There's anti-Semitic thoughts in it, but it was the precursor for turning the medical industry into what it is to now. And as you know, Rockefeller, Big Oil, basically Big Oil branched off. You still have Big Oil. Now you've got Big Pharma, which a lot of them are pharmaceuticals are petroleum based.
And you get into the pharmacy, the pharmacy companies now, big pharma. And I used to be against going off on big pharma because it was always leftists that were going off on it back before I started kind of waking up and saying it doesn't matter left and right. It's not really a thing. But modern pharmacy's origins come from apothecaries, and their apothecaries were your guys that you did get medicine from, going into the early 1800s. Well, some of these apothecaries started getting big in around 1840, and one of them is Merck in Germany. Everybody's heard of Merck.
Yep.
Well, that was established in Germany in 1668, but they started getting wholesale and really huge in the 1840s, and then you start getting there became gradually over the decades in the mid 1800s a marriage between these apothecaries and chemical companies. And so you start getting Merck in Germany, 1668. They start getting big in the 1800s, and then you get Abbott, SmithKline, and Eli Lilly in the U.S. from the 1830s to almost to 1900. They start becoming big pharmaceutical companies, and then that all starts merging because a lot of chemical companies at the time were starting to look at branching out into medicines and stuff.
Right.
And so then in the chemical sphere, you get Bayer in Germany and Pfizer in the U.S. They're these big pharmaceuticals,
right?
But they started out as chemical companies, and that's what's being put in our bodies when we go and get aspirin and things. It's a lot of this is derived from natural things, but they co-opt it. And then a lot of these huge companies now, of course, they're what's the word where they have a trademark, not a trademark, but
copyright. I know what you're talking
patents.
about.
They have patents on things. They make a small change to a natural thing, and then they patent it, and now they own it, and nobody else can use it without authorization.
Right.
So you have all these huge pharmaceutical companies that come out of this in the late 1800s into the 1900s, and it goes in tandem with the Flexner report. You start standardizing and making it all the same for everyone, and humans or individuals are different, but breaking away the doctor with patient relationship.
All right. And so it upset a lot of people, but just like now where you have pay to play and follow the money, to help with the transition and change the minds of other doctors and scientists, John D. Rockefeller gave millions to colleges, hospitals, and founded a philanthropic front group called General Education Board. When Flexner researched his report, many American medical schools were small proprietary trade schools owned by one or more doctors unaffiliated with a college or university.
And those doctors directly connected to their patients.
It's kind of like what the Fed did for banking. The Flexner report allowed the medical industry to be just kind of standardized and controlled. And I don't think anybody can say that it was for the better. As a matter of fact, they are now learning, some people are, that the script is flipping again because people are losing trust in the medical industry. This one thing that I read said, physicians have lost their authenticity as trusted healers. We become derelict in many realms. And while this article that I was reading, they're not really quite understanding how right and how far it's gone the other way. But COVID has definitely flipped the script. But what I want to say more about the Flexner report was the characters that were involved. You had Rockefeller, you had Carnegie. When I was researching, I found somewhere where William Gates was involved. When it turned out to be, it wasn't a William Gates because that's Bill Gates' dad. It was Frederick Gates. And Frederick Gates was Frederick Gates was the Bill Gates of today. He was Rockefeller's philanthropist advisor for all of his stuff outside of Standard Oil. We're talking and he probably oversaw about $500 million for different causes. And so when I was researching this, I came across this article that one of Facebook's fact checkers was fact checking some information shared on Facebook about Bill Gates. What was Bill Gates' grandfather doing during the Spanish flu? And that's where I learned that it wasn't William Gates, it was Frederick Gates. But listen to this and think about this in light of these people being the people that flipped the medical industry upside down. Because the story was, what was Bill Gates' grandfather doing during the Spanish flu? Newsfront, November 7th editorial. So-called Spanish flu began in 1918 and disappeared in 1920. Caused the death of almost 550 people. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research carried out a large-scale bacterial meningitis vaccination in the U.S. Army in 1918 and was supervised by Frederick Gates. And this article is contending that Frederick Gates is Bill Gates' grandfather. So here's the fact check. Disseminated information is partly false because Bill Gates' grandfather was not Frederick Gates, but William Henry Gates. So they had the wrong Gates. But the interesting thing to me is they said Frederick L. Gates did participate in World War I. He, as well as his father, Frederick Taylor Gates, participated in the meningitis vaccination process. So I don't know how many of you know that there was a vaccine for meningitis in 1918, and Frederick Gates.
In which hundreds and thousands of soldiers started having all these symptoms and diarrhea and vomiting.
And they claimed that it didn't, there was very, they had diarrhea and fever. They said there were minor things that happened, but I pulled up from the I got so many papers here. Journal of Experimental Medicine. So when I read the fact check, that's the first time I'd heard of the vaccine, the meningitis vaccine of 1918. And in this Journal of Experimental Medicine, it talks about that vaccine. And they say that it was only given to 3,700 volunteers from the military. But it says that one of the rare occurrences was symptoms were in part those of meningeal irritation and sometimes simulated the onset of meningitis. So the vaccine came about in January 1918. And then
around the time of the start of the Spanish flu, and supposedly they don't even know how it started, where it came from, but they thought a lot of the suppositions are that it started with soldiers, and then soldiers going home from the front, spreading it to their home countries and going from there.
Right. So that was interesting to me, just stumbling upon that, and that the person that was involved in that was Frederick Gates, who was also involved in the Flexner report that flipped the medical industry upside down, and who was also Rockefeller. He was basically the Bill Gates of today. And it's also interesting, okay, they're not related to Bill Gates, but geez, what a coincidence. And so another man that was involved in the Hopkins circle part of this Flexner report was William Osler, and he was selected by William Welsh, who was the founding dean of Johns Hopkins. And so when I was looking up this guy, I'm reading about him, and I come across this Wikipedia page where it talks about this controversy. So again, keep in mind, these are guys that flipped the medical industry upside down. So the controversy on this guy was, Osler is well known in the field of gerontology for the speech he gave when he was leaving Hopkins to become professor of medicine at Oxford. And he gave this speech called the Fixed Period. And it included some controversial words about older age. Osler, who had a well-developed humorous side to his, notice how they write glowingly about him. Humorous side to his character was in his mid-50s when he gave the speech, and in it he mentioned Anthony Trollope's The Fixed Period from 1882, which envisaged, I don't know how to say that. Envisaged a college where men retire at 67 and after being given a year to settle their affairs, would be peacefully extinguished by chloroform. He claimed that the effective moving, vitalizing work of the world is done between the ages of 25 and 40, and it was downhill from then on. Osler's speech was covered by the popular press, which headlined their reports with Osler recommends chloroform at 60. The concept of mandatory euthanasia for humans after a fixed period, often 60 years.
Because some certain people have decided that you're no longer of use.
Notice that when your Social Security was kick in at, was it 67 or 60?
Well, 65 at first.
Became a recurring theme in the 20th century imaginative literature. For example, Isaac Asimov's 1950 Pebble in the Sky. In the third edition of his textbook, he also coined the description of pneumonia as the friend of the aged, since it allowed elderly individuals a quick, comparatively painless death. Taken off by it in an acute, short, and often painless illness, the old man escapes those cold gradations of decay so distressing to himself and his friends. Coincidentally, Osler himself died of pneumonia.
Well, I'm basically saying that that people will not want to be a burden to other parts of society. And a lot of long words there and long paragraph for euthanasia.
Right. And so that's one of the Hopkins circles, John Hopkins, was involved in the Flexner report. And these two people, the first dean of John Hopkins, and then that guy, Osler.
And so you have people very critical to the founding of Johns Hopkins University, and which is closely tied to the CDC going back into the 50s and 40s, even.
John Hopkins is at the heart of like the COVID plan. That's
what I'm saying is that they've been at the hip to the CDC since at least the 50s. We talked about Alexander Langmuir,
right? And the reason that we think of Johns Hopkins as like the gold standard is because of the Flexner report. The Flexner report wanted John Hopkins to be the university that everyone mirrored themselves after, but of course they did. You had two, members
of Johns Hopkins
in on the Flexner report. There's kind of a bias there. That's another thing that I mentioned, that the thoughts and the concepts in the Flexner report had already been thought up and written up by a medical organization called CFAC. But they worried they couldn't sell it to the public because it would be
it would come from the doctors themselves,
right,
wanting this change. And
this change definitely made it more lucrative to be. I mean, it turned it into
the grind that it is now.
Right. The Flexner report also made it where, when you go to become a doctor, especially a surgeon, you devote a large part of your life to becoming that. It didn't used to be all consuming. And it didn't used to be that you were removed from like the realities of life. And
now they have you go into your residency and you go in this grind and you're up for days, and you've got to actually, at the very least, you've got to chug a lot of caffeine to keep going, to get through this for several years.
Right.
And so what does that do to a person? It kind of breaks them and then remolds them into what they want.
Right. It even talks about in here that it didn't give them time to think. And I thought that was an interesting. They didn't want them thinking. So there's a lot of doctors that look down on like.
So who wants to go, I don't want my doctor thinking.
Right.
I don't want them to have time for
we
that.
want them to think this certain way, the same standards that every other doctor thinks. And if they don't, then they're a quack. But two more points about the Flexner report. Abraham Flexner, who the guy they got to write it, was not a doctor. He had never set foot in a medical institution. He was a teacher. He didn't even have a degree.
And today with his credentials that he didn't get, he probably would not have been allowed to be an elementary school teacher in a state system because he doesn't have the right credentials.
They picked him because he could write extremely well and his disdain for traditional medicine. So basically he could sell. He agreed with them. He
wasn't a doctor, but he agreed with all of them.
And something else interesting is another reason they picked him is he was on the vaccine bandwagon because his brother was a doctor, Simon Flexner, who was also involved in the 1918 vaccine research. and the vaccine rollout for meningitis. So that's what drew their attention to this Flexner dude. And well, I say 2 more points now. Robert Brookings of the Brookings Institution was very heavily involved in some university in I think
Is it American University in St. Louis?
Yeah, I think that was the name of it. And in the Flexner report, they heavily criticized that university. So Robert Brookings requested a sit down with Flexner and some others. And so he went and met with them. And afterwards, he was all on board. He started praising it. He started telling others that, you know, they needed to do it. He got rid of and wiped out all the faculty that he had that were at that university and replaced them with, you know, academic professors. So he got all on board. And, you know, the Brookings Institute, it's been fraudulent since the beginning. Only other thing I was going to say, selected by Welsh. I lost my train of thought. There was one more important thing.
There is so much. It's
Selected by Welsh. William Osler, the one I told you about that said that about, you know, 67, you need to be chloroformed.
Yeah.
He's considered the modern.
He's the father of modern medicine.
Yeah, the father of modern medicine.
Doctors that want to kill you when you're 67. And he says a lot of glowing words about it, but it's basically, we kill you at 67. And there's movies made about stuff like this.
Right. So you have all these prestigious medical universities that we all look up to, who are all involved in COVID and everything. And we just mindlessly believe them because we've been told that they're the gold standard.
Yeah.
And I'm just here to tell you that maybe they're not.
If they've got a white coat, you should listen to them. And
yeah, white coat. That's
we still need to get some white coats. And
that's
put
a
them
whole.
on
I
one
know
time
we should do
just
that. The white
'cause then we
coats.
might
That's a
get
whole
more
nother
viewers that way.
psyop. But they didn't used to wear white coats; they wore black coats. But.
Yeah. So the Flexner report gets us into the early 1900s, 1910, and another big episode in history: Devil's Narrative, the Devil's Dilemma. The Federal Reserve is constructed in 1913. And our banking system hasn't been the same since.
Right.
And you know that led into World War I. You know, a year later. There's lots of theories about what World War I really was. But one thing I found interesting is some of you guys might be students of Admiralty law and what the American flag means, especially if you're, say, in a courtroom somewhere and it's got gold fringe around it, what that means. And we could do just a whole episode on that.
That's a whole other rabbit
Pro
hole.
777 Radio has done a bunch of stuff about that and some people he's had on. So we're not even going to dive in, but I found it interesting. I didn't know that the Federal Reserve has its own flag that flies below the United States flag at all of their buildings. And I just noticed that it has, you know, the eagle and stuff, but it has the gold fringe around around the flag. I just thought that was a
Interesting.
neat little tip. I didn't know the Federal Reserve had its own flag. That's probably not cool.
Here, click on the
Oh,
just
yeah.
to show you
And
nothing.
then Spanish flu. This is 1918, 1920, sometime around there. This is a sporting event somewhere. And look at these folks. I mean, nothing new under the sun. History repeats. Or maybe it doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. We did a show about that.
Right.
You know, and this is 100 years ago, basically, just pulling the same old crap over and over again.
Right.
And, you know, if masks work so well, and don't tell me masks are better now, because even my Mississippi State Health Department had information on their site about making your own mask out of your own shirt.
Right.
So the material would have been just as good as the material that they're using here. It did, you know, supposedly over between 500, 600,000 Americans died in the Spanish flu, which is half the time that the Civil War was, and around the same amount of casualties. That's a lot of folks.
Right.
And so you come out of the Federal Reserve, you get into World War I, and I found this nice little, you know, poster. Fall in. Is that propaganda? Answer now in your country's hour of need. And why do we go to World War I?
Fall in. So answer now in your country's. What was
hour
our
of
need?
need. Yeah.
What was the hour of need? What,
Because a ship was sunk in the Atlantic.
Lusitania?
Yeah. But we sent a bunch of boys, a bunch of our young men over to Europe to die in muddy fields, mostly in France.
Yeah.
For what?
Wiped out
I mean,
tens of
and we
thousands of our
America didn't lose.
strongest men.
America didn't lose near as many as England and France because they were in it from 14. We didn't get there till, I don't think we got in the war 16, but it wasn't until like 17, 18 that we really started showing up. General Pershing and the American Expeditionary Force. You know, we've all fallen for these spells, and what we want to do in this scope tonight is just kind of point out this is retro, looking back and kind of, Monday morning quarterbacking, but maybe try to be on guard for the next one that's coming.
Right, because we already see how they're writing the story of today right now. They're already lying about it.
Yeah.
So
and there's stuff that's the wool's over our eyes right now and things that are happening right now. Maybe somehow we start to see these things ourselves, as they're happening and break those spells.
Right.
And then we talked about the Spanish flu, but then you get into pre-World War II and between 1 and 2. Some people would actually posit on that, there was a 30 Years War. What was it, 1600s? That this was the second 30 Years War instead of saying World War I and World War II, because it was all connected.
Right.
World War I and II. World War I set the stage for the Second World War, and it was catastrophic. And World War II just changed this
everything.
country, changed the world, catapulted America into the world police and all this.
Right.
And it changed the mindset of the country. We were more of a isolationist bent, and staying out of the conflicts. And I remember we were researching about Nixon and found that Gerald Ford was a big America First guy back in the 30s with Charles Lindbergh,
Right.
and staying out of the war. But he went to the Pacific and came back a strong internationalist.
Yeah.
And that's where we get a lot of it. World War II sets the stage for the 50s and 60s with media and everything about.
Well, there was just so much money, the expansion of government, the money, and what they did is instead of those programs or those departments ending, they transitioned into other branches of government.
We get the CIA, and the CIA, of course, from the very beginning is wedded to all the major newspapers, and then with the television starts to come out in the 50s, and they're in with the networks, and they've seen videos. The CIA helps. They basically produce a lot of the movies that you see. And
right.
The
Well,
CIA,
they definitely are the reason we have this concept of the CIA and the FBI and
these
Pentagon,
super agents. You see James Bond.
and then who do you get? What was Peter Strzok?
Peter Strzok.
Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, like totally the opposite of what you imagine.
And here's this is a World War II poster. Defend American freedom. It's everybody's job. Look at this glamorous drawing of some strong, almost, it's like a strong young Uncle Sam.
Yeah.
He's got a nice tan.
Yeah. It's everybody's job.
But then, we talked about apocalypse before.
I know. So for the people that don't know, apocalypse in ancient Greek
Right.
is a great revealing. It's revelation.
An unveiling.
And the scope that we did about it was that, the apocalypse, the end times, what you imagine happens in Revelations, that maybe that's not.
And it's not, an apocalypse is something we go through our life. Everybody goes through. It's like the book of Revelation could have been called book of apocalypse. Those terms are almost synonymous.
Yeah.
And it's something, it's like the Bible is living. We are in the Bible right now. We're going to get into that later also. It's not an ancient book that's telling old stories. Every day we are living these stories. And apocalypse is, I believe, it can be different for everyone. We're at different levels. We
Right.
all need to awaken and see the unveiling. And so, we actually had a couple of scopes about apocalypse.
Yeah.
We had one about nostalgia a couple of months ago about, we think we remember times better. We remember a media that was good and
That
honest.
reported
that
the truth
reported.
when actually we're remembering a time when, who's that? Brinkley,
Cronkite.
and Brinkley, something Brinkley. They all reported on the the Tet Offensive and the Gulf of Tonkin. Like
Yeah.
they sold basically the military-industrial complex's narrative.
Yeah.
We just didn't know.
I'm glad you said military-industrial complexes. I know a lot of you guys have heard about Eisenhower's great speech at the end of his term, on the eve of him giving up his office after his 8 years, that he talked about the military-industrial complex and what a great threat it was. But what is omitted, it's reporting by omission or whatever, the way the media does. He talked a great deal about a scientific technological complex that was even probably more dangerous. And nobody talks about that, but that's where we're at now, this scientific technology.
And you can see through what happened through, pandemic, how destructive.
And even though Ike supposedly warned us about this, I still question him, and I'm not really impressed because he served as president for 8 years.
And didn't do anything.
And then on the eve of his leaving, he goes, "Hey guys, I need to tell you, man, there's some bad stuff in the works.
He left that for his
We
legacy.
need to do something about it." And everybody goes, "Oh, Ike, man, he spoke the truth. He told us about it." I'm like,
yeah.
He didn't say it for 8 years, and he was supposedly the guy in charge. So, was he really in charge, or was that his chance at a shot because he knew he was going out? Maybe I'm thinking, he wasn't this brave man. He was just a weak guy, but he had enough courage on that last couple of days in office to say that.
Yeah.
And we talked about, we'll talk about the 60s real quick, because you get World War II, traumatic, ball busting, destructive event worldwide.
If World War II had been videoed the way the Vietnam was, we did not have Vietnam.
No,
because it was worse.
Because guys came back heroes, and I would bet most of them were like, "No, man, I want to forget about it. It was awful."
Granddad never wanted to talk about it.
No, he never talked about it. And he was in there for almost 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, our granddad was D-Day plus like 4 or 5, something
supposedly
like that.
liberated one of the camps.
Yeah. So World War II sets up, you get the CIA coming out, you get NASA's coming in soon, being founded by people from Nazi Germany, by the way. And you get into the 50s, and you've got the CIA with newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, and all the television stations that are starting to come up with the invention of TV.
Right.
You get to the 60s, and there's so much turmoil in the 60s, and you've got 1963 and JFK is assassinated. Who knows if that really happened? How about this, guys? A lot of people from that era believe that they saw JFK assassinated on TV. And
I always thought they did.
That's what we kind of touched on that with nostalgia when we talked about that. Nostalgia being, it can be a good thing, because nostalgia is good when your memories of an era or a time are actual things that
real memories
happen to
with
you,
your family
that you remember. But then there's a bad nostalgia that's set up, and media does this, and corporations with advertisement, they paint a picture of a time, and you think, oh yeah, or even with music. I can remember in the 80s, I can associate certain songs in the 80s with good times,
right?
Even though I may have forgotten there's some bad things happening,
right?
But nostalgia and looking at the JFK assassination, a lot of people believe they saw him assassinated on TV. Well, because of the Zapruder film,
right?
That film was not released to the public until 8 years after the event,
right?
And I didn't know that.
And when it was released, it was edited. It had been edited. It took out. It said like 4 seconds of the shooting, because the Zapruder said that he thought it would be too much for the people to handle. Although what we saw,
that mentality goes along with the whole, even the Flexner report and everything.
Yeah,
there's a small group of people in this world who believe they know the best for everybody else,
right?
And that, oh, we don't want you to see that. We need you to treat you this way. I mean, it's all the same thing. So you get in the 60s, and you got this traumatic assassination of a president. You get into 68, and you've got Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy being assassinated. And then you get to 69, and there's 4 traumatic events, because Yvonne popped it up today. Chappaquiddick, Ted Kennedy let a girl drown in the car that he was driving.
Supposedly, allegedly.
Allegedly, yeah. I need to get that shirt.
Allegedly. And then the next day after that was the moon landing.
The next day was this moon landing. And then within weeks of all of this is Woodstock and the Manson murders.
Right.
And supposedly Sharon Tate killed and her baby cut out of the womb. And
now go back and look for the evidence that happened.
Can't find
Go back and look for the evidence that the moon landing happened. Well, you could, but NASA taped over the telemetry tape.
You can't look at the pictures of the
Chappaquiddick, Ted Kennedy, that there was never any hard proof of that, but we did it when we did a scope on that where we talked about how Ted Kennedy may not have been the guilty one, but
who knows, because a script is always being written by somebody when we see this stuff. And so we're gonna, this episode's titled The Devil's Dilemma. And I really looked into the meaning of the word dilemma itself, but again, with our scopes, we're not the be all end all. We don't know everything. We're discovering things and using our discernment.
Right.
We pray to God for wisdom and discernment. It says in the Bible, He's given us these tools. They're in us, and we can decide for ourselves what's true and what's not. That's what everybody does every day. Oh well, not everybody. A lot of people just listen.
Yeah.
But I'm looking at the devil's dilemma in a two-pronged way. One is that the devil's only power, which he can't stand probably, is that he doesn't really have any power. His only power is enticement and temptation. He talked to Adam and he talked to Eve into, metaphorically biting this apple in the garden.
Right.
He tries to paint a picture for you, and then you decide. And I think way back when, Eve's discernment failed. Adam's discernment definitely failed because he should have been saying, "Hey, no, let's stop." They both failed that. So they decided for themselves what was best, and they took the wrong choice.
Right.
So part of what the devil's dilemma is that I bet he's frustrated all the time. He hates everything. He hates God's creation. He wants his whole goal throughout the history since Adam and Eve is to tear down man, which in some ways he's been successful, but God's going to ultimately be successful. But he wants to tear down man and have God look at it and go, see what you've made. This is what it is. I'm your boy. I should have been the guy the whole time.
Right.
But I bet he's so frustrated every day because there are people out there that like, you know what? I see you for what you are. You're nothing. You're not. You're a faker, a copycat. You can't do anything. You really don't have any power. It's just our appetites and our desires that are not in accordance with God's will, that God actually wants the best for us if we would see it right. The other part of the devil's dilemma, I think, is it's basically a false binary, a false dichotomy that he puts out. And one thing I saw about dilemma, it's a problem offering two possibilities, neither of which is decidedly acceptable or preferable. And these possibilities could be referred to as the horns of the dilemma. And I've never seen that written about dilemma when I started looking this up. And so when a dilemma, you have dilemmas and there's certain times, but when you apply dilemma incorrectly, as in you must accept A or B, then it constitutes a false binary or a fallacy. And a fallacy, which I have a nice little thing for this, is a use of invalid or faulty reasoning to construct an argument. And so you start off in a bad place.
All right.
And then sometimes, I would say a lot of times, fallacies are used intentionally to manipulate or persuade by deception, that's constant in this world. And our churches can be guilty of it, maybe not on purpose, but they're going down. Everybody is susceptible to listening to the world's narrative. And so when you're faced with choosing A or B going forward, start to maybe step back, get in a quiet place and talk to God and say, give me discernment. And some of these logical fallacies are the ad hominem, and we see that all the time. You attack the person making the argument. You don't attack the argument itself. That's one of the easy ones. Straw man, you argue against somebody and you say, oh, so you're saying, and you put in something false You make a straw man say, this is, oh, you're going to argue against something you know you can win.
Right.
And then, of course, the slippery slope, claiming that a single event will inevitably give rise to a chain of future events. I mean, none of us know the future, that's for sure. And so when you're faced with choosing A or B, what we need to start countering with, that is not all.
Right.
It's a whole lot bigger than that. And when we are able to push through this false binary, this fallacy, another way of putting it is you are escaping through the horns of the dilemma. And I found that kind of neat that it's through the horns, and we sometimes we picture the devil as having two horns.
Right.
And that could be, and then the two horns are the false choices, pushing through the false binary or fallacy. And I saw one definition of fallacy. It comes from Greek. It's a double proposition. And in math and in informal logic, the lemma part of dilemma is a proven proposition, and the makes that double part of it. And so the devil does use some truth in to kind of mimic, and maybe some of the stuff he said to Eve in the garden that day there was some truth in there, but he puts all this other stuff in to make you not make you, but entice you into choosing that wrong path.
Divide, like divide, dilemma.
And so, I forgot this one, a couple of quotes, and when we were talking about the pharmaceutical industry, and we're going to wrap up Devil's Dilemma and about being in the world and not of it after this. But one quote is from.
Oh, are you serious?
These guys
lost it.
These guys suck.
But
I can pull it up. So Voltaire, he had this to say. This is in the 1700s. There were fights going on 1700s, 1800s about how this world was going to go. His quote is, "Doctors are men who prescribe medicines of which they know little to cure diseases of which they know less, and human beings of whom they know nothing." And whether a lot of people are well-meaning and think they're doing right, but a lot of us fall for the wrong thing. And another good quote in the late 1800s was Florence Nightingale, and she talks about disease. She says the specific disease doctrine is the grand refuge of weak, uncultured, unstable minds, such as now rule in the medical profession. And she was part of that, maybe a small part of that fight between Pasteur and Beauchamp. There are no specific diseases. There are specific disease conditions. Right. And I can see that because I think there are a lot of correlations with who dies from what when there's something happen, when people call it disease.
Well, yeah, it's interesting too that her being female, and one of the effects of the Flexner report was flipping that to being a more male dominated,
probably European male dominated.
So basically, the Flexner report was anti-woman, anti-black, anti-Jew, but they all praise it. They'll get around to, I think, going after the racial aspect, but they haven't so far.
Yeah. So I have some Bible verses that kind of get into it. It's this. I'm hoping we got across tonight. The theme of this scope is in the world, not of it, and how we see it. And we've got to, again, use our discernment to kind of try to see through these things, and with God's help, do that. And it's our churches too. It's the media. It's everything.
Yeah, and always beware of the false binary where they say, okay, well, we can do this or we can do this, and know that it never comes down to just two choices.
Or even if you're accused of something and you're standing for truth on something, and somebody says, well, oh, you say this, well, then you must be this.
Right. No.
And step back and go, hold on a second. That's not.
It's just like Joe. I mean, we already showed Joe Biden's tweet.
No, we didn't.
Joe Biden's tweet's a very good example of this on the vaccine. It's simple. Get vaccinated or wear a mask. The choice is yours. I like how he says the choice is yours. All right, you can take that off. So the choice is yours, though. He's right about that. The choice is yours to just
But it's the step out of that. I
saw somebody before when I was coming over here, this girl doing a TikTok that was reading that. She reads that and she goes, what that is right there is words.
Yeah.
You don't have to do anything. There's no, authority that's going to make it. It's just words. Ignore them.
Yeah, that's it.
Um,
And so one of the Bible verses, and I'm not having the whole verse, but I'm going to say where it is in the Bible. Second John 15:19. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. And so if you start to come up against, if you start to stand up for truth and things that you believe in and coming from the Bible, just if the world hates you, you're probably in a good spot
yeah.
with the Lord and with your spirit, with the Holy Spirit. Romans 12:1-2. Do not conform to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We got to remember that this is a spiritual battle. It's not going to be
And it's
fixed
constant.
with politics.
It's constant.
And it's every day. We have to wake up every day
By the
and
renewing of
our mind. Ephesians 6:12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil. And then 1 Peter 2:11-12. I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners, this is us in the world, to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very soul. And then
I would say that wage war against your very soul. That's when the devil's dilemma will confront you, and where you have these people that they want the fame, they want the money, they want the glory so bad that they'll sell their soul.
Yeah, and there's another Bible, I can't remember where it is, but it's what good is what profit a man if he gains the world
but loses his own soul.
Yeah. And Owen and I got, we're living in the Bible now. I get that from Owen Benjamin. He's been enlightening to me for a lot of things. He said today, toward the end of his stream, he said, you're in the Bible right now. The Bible is a guidebook. We're in it. It's not something, and even like the Revelation, chapter Revelation, it's happened. It's going to happen again. It's happening now. So we're not supposed to sit around and wait for some great cataclysm to happen. And then I believed in Jesus and now I'm relieved of my burdens and I'm going. No, it's Revelation, Apocalypse is something that we all go through. We have different levels, different things that we have to see and enlighten ourselves. And we don't have the patent or whatever on what salvation is. We've got to find it between us and God individually. Right. And one of the basic, and Owen says this a lot too, it's so simple. And he's gotten into fights about the Trinity and things like that. And everybody's got their doctrines. And I've heard of, from relatives of mine, if you're not baptized, you're still going to hell.
Right.
One of the things Jesus says a couple of times in the New Testament is, you don't decide that. You can't say that's between you and God. There is nobody on this earth, no matter what religion or whatever, can tell you where you're going after you're on this short time here.
Right.
But one of the most basics in the Bible is so simple: is love your neighbor as yourself and love God. And if you do just these two things, and it's hard sometimes,
right?
But if you do those two things, I think you're going to be in pretty good shape. And maybe that'll piss people off too. But
yeah, and so I think it's nice to know that I don't have to buy into the false binary of, if only the right could get in, everything would be okay.
Yeah.
Or the Democrat, it's Democrats or Republicans, rich, poor, black, white, get vaccine,
Muslim, Christian.
That right now it's the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Yeah.
We don't know the truth of what's going on over there, and I don't believe a word.
And we were talking about that earlier tonight. I said, I bet that there's a bunch of Palestinians on one side and a bunch of Israelis on another going, oh, not this again.
Yeah, and they're kind of like us in that we have no control over what our leaders are doing.
Yeah.
But we can win this by going, whenever you see those headlines, going, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
And live your life the way that you're supposed to. Love God, love man, get back in touch with nature. Stop believing that the doctors, the meaning of doctor is to doctor something. Yeah. You ever thought about that?
No, I haven't. There's so many words that we can look at again, re-look at and go, wait a minute, what does that word really mean?
Right. So this beware of the false binary of that if not this, then this. That there's the options are probably limitless, and it's up to you.
And I think the in the world not of it is also letting go of a lot of things and preconceptions and just stepping back. And I see, I'm not on Twitter near as much as I used to, but I still see people, oh, they can still overturn the 2020 election or something. I'm like, that is not.
But the thing about that to me is this: if it's in the script, they can over it. But you know what? That still doesn't solve the problem. So
because
actually that can happen, because just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean that it
Yeah.
can't. But my thing is, no one man is ever going to save you, because it's up to us.
And we started saying that even before the election.
Right.
We were kind of getting disenchanted already and I'm glad that the world has happened the way it is. I'm thankful for it, because I'm seeing that I don't have to be drawn in and like a cat, looking
Right.
at the laser pointer all the time. It's like, stop doing that.
And furthermore, if it's in the script that he gets back in there, I think we would be wise to realize that all the lockdowns, all the things that have happened this last year would have not have been possible unless Trump had bought into and been the pharmaceutical sales for vaccines.
Yeah.
So he's a man.
Mhm.
So even if that happens, it doesn't solve anything. If it doesn't happen, it's like we're still in the same.
Yeah.
Until we wake up to our role in all of this.
And our role is probably a lot more local than we even know.
Yeah, a lot more local and actually a lot more powerful than anybody imagines. But
Yeah.
anyway, I think that's all
I think
we've
that's
got.
all we got. We went, we threw a lot of stuff out there. Hope to be back in June. I don't know if we can make the Ides. It'd be the 13th.
Yeah, maybe we can. You never know, but
If it's on a Saturday, it could happen.
yeah. So anyway, thank you guys for tuning in. And if you like this, we hope you'll share it. I usually share this on Periscope, which
But now it looks like it's down for good. Maybe.
I don't know why I can't share it. But
Wasn't broadcasting.
anyway, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.